name is Todd Hopkins. I'm the science coordinator for the Great Basin Landscape Conservation Cooperative based in Reno, Nevada. Today we have a webinar for you on how you can engage in the Northwest Basin and Range Synthesis Project. We'll have two other speakers today, Tom Mewald, geographer in Portland with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Levi Old, our project coordinator based in Lakeview, Oregon. Next slide. So before we begin, I want to tell you all what we're going to be doing here. We're going to have a webinar and you'll be able to comment as we go along and ask questions. We have Liz Mack from Enviro Issues helping run the webinar and follow your comments. If you click on the tab on the top right, the little orange tab, you'll get a pop-out window. And then, there we go, then you can type your comments in down there 2/3 of the way down on the right. And after you type your comment in, hit send. And Liz will gather those comments up, and she'll interrupt us if it's important and necessary, or we'll save them to the end and go through them one at a time then. So please feel free to type in comments or questions as we go through the webinar. And now I'm going to turn this over to Levi Old, who's going to kick things off. Levi?
Hi Todd, thanks for the introduction. We need your input. Today we plan to share ways in which you can get involved in the Northwest Basin and Range Synthesis Project. The Great Basin Landscape Conservation Cooperative would like this to be a shared process that includes a diverse group of interests and stakeholders from across the landscape. At the end of today's webinar, we'd like you to fill out a 4-question questionnaire that will allow you to share if and where you would like to get involved in the project. There are 3 primary components that will make up today's webinar. First, we will state why we see the need to embark upon this landscape-level conservation process in the Northwest Basin and Range. Second, there are many large landscape conservation synthesis projects similar to the proposed Northwest Basin and Range Synthesis. Tom Mewald from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will share an example from close to home of a similar effort in the arid lands of eastern Washington. This will include how the people in eastern Washington are using the products from this effort. Lastly, we'll give a brief overview on the Northwest Basin and Range Synthesis, an update on our recent work, and share how you can get involved. Now we will answer the question, why embark upon a project at the landscape scale? I'd like to share a quote with you about large landscape conservation from researcher Matthew McKinney et al. The most important land and water conservation issues facing North America, including land use patterns, sustainable water management, biodiversity protection, and adaptation to climate change, require new approaches. While most of these conservation challenges need to be addressed at several scales simultaneously, ranging from the local to the global, it is increasingly imperative to address them at the scale of large landscapes. The territory of these issues often transcends the legal and geographic reach of existing jurisdictions and institutions. The Northwest Basin and Range is one of the most intact ecoregions in North America. For the future of this landscape's health, in order to manage and prioritize effectively across boundaries, there's a need to create shared priorities on the landscape based off of a multi-species, multi-habitat approach. Perhaps there is a shelf full of many different plans, assessments, and scientific literature somewhere in your office that looks a bit like this. With the help of people and organizations across the landscape, the Northwest Basin and Range Synthesis is here to take all these plans off the shelf, collect the many ones that exist around the landscape, and synthesize them for everyone's use. We have collected and are swimming through, so to speak, over 60 plans in the Northwest Basin and Range region. We would like to synthesize and complement these efforts. We are not necessarily trying to recreate the wheel, but instead provide a landscape-level picture of what these plans have in common. Using a tool for tackling complex conservation problems called the Open Standards for the Practice of Conservation, we synthesized these plans to see where the most overlap occurs and started to form a list of shared priorities. We are ready to take this out onto the landscape to vet with experts. We will share more about this process later in the presentation. This map demonstrates the other landscape conservation synthesis projects occurring in sagebrush ecosystems of the West. These processes each take a different approach and are often called landscape conservation design efforts. Note the LCD abbreviation on the other projects shown on the map. I'll now pass it off to Tom Mewald to share about the project in the northwest corner of this map, the Columbia Plateau Landscape Conservation Design, otherwise known as the Arid Lands Initiative. Tom?
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot, Levi. And thanks, everybody, for joining today, too. So I'm going to briefly talk about landscape conservation design. Next slide. Which is this concept that Levi's been talking about looking at the larger landscape and identifying shared priorities. And so this is a topic that is being developed through the LCCs at a national scale. And there's four kind of broad elements that are part of landscape conservation design. So the first is convening stakeholders in the region and identifying shared goals and targets. Assessing the condition, both current and future condition of the landscape. Third component, spatial planning, is identifying a network of priority places that represent how to meet those shared goals and objectives at the landscape scale. And then finally, strategic design, or identifying who does what where on the landscape to implement that conservation plan. And so it's really getting at this concept of collective impact in many ways, of moving the needle at the landscape scale by working together through a shared vision and goals and objectives. Again, it's a non-regulatory concept. It's more of how can we step up to the plate and identify our collective roles at the landscape scale. Next slide. And so I'm going to show an example of landscape conservation design and those four elements using the Columbia Plateau with Arid Lands Initiative as a case study. And I want to call out Sonia Hall, who is the coordinator for this project, and the group of people and agencies and organizations that convened. Next slide. To take a look at this broad landscape and some of the stressors and threats that were occurring across the landscape. One of the biggest issues out there is the issue of habitat connectivity. And this group of organizations, NGOs, state agencies, federal agencies, and others got together to identify, the fact that they cannot meet the needs for connectivity, for a connected landscape across this whole landscape. There's no one agency organization that can do that. There's a broad, fragmented ownership across this landscape. So how can we bring together the best available science and information to meet our conservation goals? Next slide. So I'm not going to read through this whole goal statement, but basically, what the group got together and identified a shared goal and vision, and then from that identified a suite of conservation targets, we'll call them, that represent the full landscape. For example, shrub steppe habitats, sage grouse, looking at riverine ecosystems, riparian zones, wetlands, grasslands, cliffs, caves, and talus, and basically a whole suite of systems that represent the entire landscape. Next slide. And with this information, with these conservation targets, basically there was a spatial assessment that was done, so looking at that assessment piece. A big part of this was looking at connectivity zones. So working with the Washington Habitat Connectivity Working Group, identified a suite of connectivity zones across the region for a suite of targets or conservation species. And then also looked at a number of different data sets that represents habitat condition biological data that represents rare and endemic species, priority species. We looked at TNC's resiliency data. Basically, we matched a lot of different data sets together to identify what we're calling these core areas. Next slide. And we put these together to develop this spatial design for the landscape. This is a map that the group has developed and represents a shared vision spatially across the landscape for a roadmap to meet the conservation goals and objectives that they've identified. Next slide. So now with this map, the group is now identifying shared strategies. Again, this is a non-regulatory thing, so nobody has to do anything, but everybody being convened and being, having their voice heard through this project and being a part of the project now knows how to use this information to influence their own planning efforts. For example, the NRCS is using this under the Sage-Grouse Initiative to identify grasslands of special significance. The BLM is using it for resource management planning. Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife is using this for land protection easement purchases. And the Partners for Fish and Wildlife Service are also using this to identify priority places for engaging with private landowners. So hopefully this gives you a sense of landscape conservation design through those 4 elements. Again, those 4 elements represent 4 very broad things that are part of this landscape conservation design process. And I think that there's a lot of freedom and creativity for us in this geography to develop something that may look like this, it may look different, there may be different methods. It's all based upon what users and the stakeholders and groups in this area would like to see out of this project. So thank you very much, and I'll pass it back to you, Levi.
Thanks, Tom. The goal of the Northwest Basin Range synthesis, as we've laid it out so far, is to synthesize existing landscape planning and science to develop a shared conservation vision for regional stakeholders. Much of the direction of the project will be decided upon at our first steering committee meeting on May 27th. The proposed concepts and approaches that we're explaining today, as well as examples from other similar projects from around the country, will be shared with the committee at its first meeting. This is the proposed project area. The area includes part of South Central and Southeastern Oregon, Northwest Nevada, and a small part of Northeast California. The boundary was drawn using watersheds and eco-regional approach. It is based on closed basin watersheds and the Northern Basin and Range Ecoregion 3 classification. The proposed project area is adaptable, and our plan is to solidify the official boundary at the first steering committee meeting. There are many boundaries and management agencies managing land on this landscape. Often planning stops at these borders. These maps here represent just a few of the land management districts in the area in a general land ownership map in the bottom right corner. This is our proposed project approach. There are 3 components to the Northwest Basin Range synthesis process. The final outcome could be a variety of products based on stakeholder interest and need. The foundation of the approach is relatively simple. We're developing this approach along with those who have the time and interest to provide their expertise and knowledge. The region is well planned, however plans and assessments are completed for a particular species in a particular geography or for a given jurisdiction. How can we ensure that these various actions lead to sustainability and resiliency across the landscape? So the first thing we've done is uncover existing plans and pull them into a common framework using the Open Standards for Conservation tool, which I mentioned before. Now we want to get input from more folks. Did we capture the synthesis and prioritization effort correctly? Has anything changed? Is there new data or information out there that we're missing? From there, we will start to identify strategies for shared targets across the landscape. We've also started to explore a component to the project revolving around approaches for engaging local communities, incorporating social and economic components on the landscape. We are in the initial stages of the development of this part of the project. More in a minute on this component we're calling human dimensions. Remember this slide from earlier? Now we're going to explain how you can get involved. We need your input to create a shared conservation vision for the Northwest Basin and Range. We use a series of teams to work towards the overall approach and outcomes of the Northwest Basin and Range synthesis. The backbone team, a steering committee, a science and technical team, and a larger group of stakeholders. The backbone team will be doing most of the heavy lifting for the project. The team currently consists of Great Basin LCC staff and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service staff. We hope more people will join. This team does require more of a time commitment. This team will work on the project from day to day. We are building towards our first steering committee meeting on May 27th in Lakeview, Oregon. The steering committee will provide overall guidance and oversight on the project. We also plan on them being the main channel of communication back to the organizations they represent. We are hoping the first meeting will allow the committee to make some decisions on the overall project direction. The team will meet on an as-needed basis approximately quarterly. The science and technical team will include conservation and human dimensions specialists like research scientists, regional biologists, and social scientists. They will provide occasional input and review on the science and technical components of the project on an as-needed basis. The stakeholder group will provide feedback where necessary, use the tools that come from the project, and stay in the loop. This will likely require just an occasional meeting or webinar. There will be a place in the questionnaire at the end of this webinar to express your interest in these teams. We understand that people value the landscape for many different reasons, including recreation, livelihoods, development, and more. This project is not just about flora, fauna, and their habitats. We see conservation biology, including human values and needs on the landscape as well. We are currently exploring ways to best engage the larger population of stakeholders and their values. We are in the initial stages of reaching out to folks with expertise on working in rural communities and with private landowners to figure out the best approach for engaging the communities in this landscape. If you have feedback on this, please provide it at the end of the presentation. There are several models for community values assessments and/or forums that could take shape throughout the synthesis process. So for a project update, since our last webinar in the fall, in the last 3 months since the project coordinator got on board, we have reached out and had meetings with over 50 stakeholders representing around 35 different organizations. We are sharing the project vision with agencies, NGOs, tribes, university faculty, experimental stations, the ranching community, and local governments. This project process is ongoing, and we are doing our best outreach to a large group of stakeholders. We are demonstrating to each stakeholder potential options for the project and asking for their input. Also, we are making progress with the initial stages of the open standards synthesis process. Soon we will begin reaching out for input to our identified science and technical teams. This process will be guided based on the outcomes and directives of the May 27th Steering Committee meeting. Finally, the goals of the Steering Committee meeting are to firm up the project scope, project boundary, and broad goals. We currently have representation from the BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Nevada Department of Wildlife, the NGO community, and other groups. We would like to see more groups represented like counties in the ranching community. We will be pursuing that interest in the coming weeks. So for a summary of today's webinar, the Northwest Basin and Range is a collaborative effort at the landscape scale. The outcomes will be directed by the teams involved and local communities. We need your input. Please feel free to reach out to us at any point and hang on for the questionnaire. Thus far, funding for this project has been provided by the Office of Wildland Fire, the Great Basin LCC, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And now I'll pass it off to Liz, our facilitator, so she can ask questions based on the questions that you all have written in to the question and comment area. Yeah, we'd like to hear your feedback and answer any questions you have, so please speak up.
All right, thank you, Levi, and just a reminder to those on the phone to make sure you enter your comments into that question box in your little control panel. We've got our first question in here, which is, this area seems like just the western portion of the northern basin and range. Why not include the full CEC level 3 ecoregion?
I can take that.
Yeah, no. Oh, go ahead.
Basically, it's a matter of capacity. Tom may want to speak to the ecological parts of this. This is Todd. But we already have a 20 million acre project area, and with the amount of staff and resources we have, we felt like we we wanted to do a good job on an area we could actually work in versus something that's really big and diffuse. Tom, you want to add to that?
Yeah, we wanted to create a geography that was actionable, and I know that once you get too large, going off into Idaho and the Snake River Plain and all that, it seemed to us at the time. Again, this is a geography that we can, it's not set in stone, so we're definitely open to that. To be frank, one of the impetuses for this was working with the National Wildlife Refuges, looking at the Sheldon Hart area and having a landscape scale look at priorities in the ecoregion that could help drive their conservation planning. So that was another aspect to the decision making about the area. But again, like I said, it's open to change.
Great. And here, a next question for you guys, which is, can you explain what you expect the project outputs to look like at the end of this process?
I could start on that. We don't want to create one of those reports that sits on that bookcase that you saw earlier. So we want to stay away from the 1,000-page technical report, but we definitely want to get something that's usable, useful to folks on the ground, using web-based technology to get our information, our products out there. We're definitely thinking about a web mapping component that shows where these priority places are on the landscape. Again, whether we create a priority map like the Arid Lands Initiative that you saw, that's up to this group to think through. Or if you want to have a tool that will help people, people can create their own map based upon different aspects of the landscape. That's another thing we can think about. So there will definitely be a web mapping and open data component to this, and I imagine there will be a report with strategies that comes out as well. But it won't be a 1,000-page pager. So anything you want to add, Levi or Todd?
Yeah, I'll add one thing, and that is that one thing that we're learning from other similar projects around the country is that whatever tool we do create as kind of a group of project teams within the synthesis project, we really want to make sure we have a focus on outreach for whatever tool that we do create, so that it doesn't just come online or come in a document and then no one really knows how to use it. We want to get out on the landscape, outreach, share, show people how to use it, show organizations how to use it, and then also seek feedback and make it an iterative process so we can keep changing things based on people's feedback. So it's an ongoing tool rather than something that, yeah, it's an ongoing tool. So.
Great. That was the last question we've received so far, but just a reminder to those on the line, you can still enter your questions by typing into that question chat box. So if you have any other questions or comments to send to the presenters, please go ahead and add those in now. We'll give another moment or two for folks to get questions in.
So I wanted to let folks know there's a website there in the middle of your screen. That's the project website that we have up. Right now it's got the first webinar and some preliminary information. But once we start having steering committee meetings and other kinds of meetings, notes and minutes and products will be posted there, at least initially, until we decide what we're going to do with this conservation design that Tom was talking about, this online design tool. It may or may not reside there.
Great, thanks Todd. And a question just came in here, and this probably is for you, Levi. Do you have any specific ideas about what representation you would like to have from each of the federal agencies?
I think that some of the initial approach that I've been using for my stakeholder engagement on the landscape, that is kind of, I made up a communications document or a communications plan and ran it by our kind of project backbone team that I've been working with so far. And we're going for kind of, higher level district managers and things like that from the BLM. We're interested in representation from, more of a state level as far as federal or state agencies go, if people are interested. But we're basically going off of interests, and that's for the steering committee. And then for the science and technical teams, ideally we get input from a variety of folks within all the different organizations as we move through the process. And that might be me meeting with folks via phone or in person, or it also could take shape in some more workshop type formats as well.
Yeah, Levi, this is Todd. The other thing we're looking for is if, say, a representative from an agency or state, we'd like someone that can take our comments, questions back to their group and then gather up responses and bring those to the table. So we're looking for someone who can help be a conduit, not necessarily just a seat in the chair with an agency logo on it.
Great, thank you guys. We still have no other questions that have come in yet, but we can give folks another moment or two if that may have spurred additional thoughts, or if anyone would like to ask any follow-up questions or add any comments, please type those on in.
I would just say too to please stick around for the questionnaire. There's a few questions on there we'd really like to get your input on. So.
Must have been a very thorough presentation because I'm still not seeing any other questions come in. So we'll just do one kind of last call for questions. So please go ahead and send something in if you have anything else you'd like to ask of the presenters. All right, well, Levi, Todd, Tom, I'm not seeing anything else come in on this end.
Okay, that sounds good.
Oh, right when I say that, one more question here. Somebody, and I can speak to this, someone was just asking if there would be a recording available of today's webinar, and yes, the session is being recorded, and we'll make that link available on the Northwest Basin and Range Synthesis website just a few days from now.
Okay, this is Levi. Thanks everyone for joining today. We really appreciate it, and please let us know your answers to the questionnaire if you have time, and/or reach out to us at any point in time. We're here and ready to hear from you all. So thanks a lot.
Thanks everyone. I want to remind you that website in the middle, there's a sign up for a newsletter there. We'll probably send them out quarterly if you just want to keep in touch with what we're doing as well.